afternoon to launch a new session of our joint seminar, IRSEM IDEA. And our guest today is Professor Nick Cull from the University of Southern California. Is going to deliver a very interesting presentation on the theme of new propaganda networks in the age of great power competition, and his paper will be dedicated to institutionalizing reputational security, reshaping the machinery US public diplomacy and international broadcasting for the post-COVID era. So let me tell you again how much we are happy to have you with us this afternoon, dear Nick. And we are very happy also to host and to have interesting conversation and discussion with our two discussants, our director, Jean-Baptiste Jeangène Vilmer, and our research fellow, Maxime Audinet. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Nicholas Cull, if you're not familiar with his work. Nick, you're originally from Britain. You're a British professor working in California at the University of Southern California. And you created in 2005 the master's program in public diplomacy. You were part of the team recognized by the U.S. Department Department of State with the Benjamin Franklin Award, and obviously you have an insight, an historical perspective, and also a policy insight because you have provided advice and training in public diplomacy to a number of foreign ministries and cultural agencies around the world, including those of the US, of course, the UK, Canada, Mexico, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. Obviously, you published many books, and among your publications, I'm very pleased to remind our audience that you published a very interesting chapter in our latest IRSEM book entitled The chapter is entitled about Great Britain. It's chapter 9 in information warfare in the digital age. In French, the title of the book is Les guerres de l'information à l'ère numérique. Among your many publications and books, obviously last year you co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Public Diplomacy. Obviously, I may say that my favorite of your books is The Cold War and the United States Information Agency, American Propaganda and Public Diplomacy, 1945-1989 at Cambridge University Press, but also Sailing War, the British Propaganda Campaign. So many thanks for being with us this afternoon. So your discussants will be Jean-Baptiste Jeangène Vilmer, who is director of the Institute of Strategic Research at the IRSEM in Paris here. Obviously, Jean-Baptiste Jeangène Vilmer has a great field of expertise, but among his many publications, obviously, he published a very interesting chapter in our IRSEM book dedicated to information warfare in the digital age. And in 2018, he was leading a program and a report on information manipulation, a challenge for our democracies, released both in French and English. A report that was delivered by the policy planning staff, the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, and the Institute for Strategic Research. So we're thrilled to listen to your discussion. Maxime Audinet is also with us with this afternoon. Maxime is a specialist of strategies of influence and information struggle. He has been a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research since December 2020. And his research focuses on the influence of authoritarian states. And in your research, Maxime, you're analyzing their actors, practices and propagation. Your research studies on the your research studies are on the field of in Russia and Ukraine more specifically, but you're also working on a different area, and especially comparing what's going on in Africa and Latin America. Okay, so I think it's time to leave the floor to Nicolas Cull, Professor Cull first, and then Maxime will have questions, and Jean-Baptiste, Jeangène, Vilmer will discuss for 10 to 15 minutes also your presentation, Professor Cull. So the floor is yours, and we're listening to you. We are thrilled to listen to your paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maud. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I wish I could be with you in person, but you know, this is a substitute. So my talk will cover a number of points. What I want to try and do is to actually look at an agenda for addressing the crisis in American public diplomacy, in America's global outreach. So first of all, I want to actually define what I see that crisis as. And I think the crisis has two distinct parts. There's a moment of crisis that has been a long time coming, which I'll talk about first. And then I want to talk specifically about the post-COVID era and issues that arise out of the pandemic. And I have 5 key areas of recommendation dealing with responses in the field of, and these correspond to my 5 areas of public diplomacy. So I'll talk about building back listening, building back the advocacy component, the cultural component, the exchange component, and how to rebuild American international broadcasting. And then I want to think about the broader issues of engagement, including use of diplomacy to address information problems, and then address the issue of reality, because you know, to me, it's really important that we don't separate information issues from reality. And I believe firmly, like Simon Anholt, that the best way to have a good image is to have a good reality, and to think about, well, what can the United States do to actually ensure the best reality? And my conclusion is that, you know, as I'm sure everybody at IRSEM already understands, that now is the time to act. And we're at a moment of extraordinary significance in the history of international relations. So first of all, how do I see our moment of crisis? Well, the first observation I'd make is that we are at a moment when the media is in crisis, and most especially there is an overlap between media and international relations. And in fact, with a return to great power rivalry, we see that the media has been weaponized, and this seems to be one of the features of our particular moment, and one which nation states seem ill-equipped to deal with. And I think part of the problem here is that there's a coincidence with a moment of technological transition. And as a historian, I'm alarmed that every time there is a major technological transition in the media, we also see problems in international relations. historically, we've tended to focus on the geography and personality aspects of the crisis in international relations and have neglected the extent to which new media made it worse. But I would say that the cheap popular press was one of the problems leading up to the First World War. I would say that the impact of radio broadcasting was one of the problems, and political destabilization coming out of that. The ability of dictators to create an electronic reality in their nations was one of the problems leading up to the Second World War. And I'm sure that television made the early stages of the Cold War worse. So I see these moments of technological transition as very dangerous in international affairs. But I also can see that we have a history of learning to deal with these things, of a kind of a collective digestion or a restabilization process. And I just hope that we can reach that restabilization without going through the horrendous experiences that generated wisdom, if you like, in 1919 or 1945. I see the new media as being like a virus which the public have yet to develop immunity to. And this restabilization is like that generation of a collective immunity or resilience. At the same time, our politics is in crisis, with problems being too big for any single actor. We need countries to work together and different kinds of actors to work together to resolve problems like the pandemic, but also like migration, the climate crisis. And yet, domestically, in the major nations of the world, we have a challenge of political gridlock. Diplomacy is also in crisis. Nation states are losing credibility at the very moment when we need their leadership. And we have the rise of the public as a factor in almost every almost every issue. And it's for this reason that I feel it's necessary to reposition soft power from being this category that is kind of like an extra thing for the richest, most successful countries, and to say, well, now we have to think about a category of reputational security, where the reputation of countries is under attack from rivals. And if you don't respond in this information space, if you don't protect the reputation of your country, then terrible things can happen. And my argument is that part of the problem for Ukraine in 2014 was that it had not achieved reputational security, and it wasn't seen as meaning anything significant to the countries of Europe, for example. So on top of this deeply problematic situation, we have COVID, where we can see that the pandemic has brought claims and counterclaims to the fore, strategically, claims about the origin of the disease, about the best way of dealing with it. There's emphasis within messaging on contributions countries are making to a global good. So which country is doing most to invent a vaccine, to share a vaccine with the world, and the flip side being attempts to brand countries as not doing enough. I think that the pandemic is providing a good example of transnational need. You can understand through the pandemic how important it is to protect everyone. And it's a tremendous moment to learn about our interdependence, because it makes no sense to have one country healthy when another country is suffering. And we saw last year how very interconnected we were. In public diplomacy terms, I should also say that the pandemic has caused material damage to programs. One of the secrets of cultural diplomacy particularly was that it was possible to subsidize those programs through getting people to pay for classes or for examinations. So all of the big European cultural diplomacy programs are now really in trouble. They were trusting to paid services, and there's a universal budget crisis. I think that there is massive change going on in terms of international reputations. I saw a piece of research last week where a panel of experts were asked, and this is a panel composed of a globally representative group of experts, were asked about their feeling about other countries, and 91% of people asked said that they were in the process of changing their opinions about countries around the world based on their behavior during the pandemic. So I think we will see shifts in how countries are regarded. We have a sense of what those shifts look like already, and I'll talk about that in questions if you are interested. But one of the most interesting phenomena we're seeing are questions that are being asked about systems. It seems pretty obvious that countries in Asia have managed the pandemic better, or at least up to this point have done better. Particularly, I think it's been a success story for South Korea. It also seems clear that the pandemic has shown problems within Western countries, and that the Western emphasis on liberty is not really compatible with best practice during a pandemic. You want people not to think for themselves, but to follow the instructions of government. So I think that in that reason alone, there's a concern over reputations coming out of the pandemic. The final point to make is that the pandemic leaves us, and this meeting is maybe an example of that, much more open to digital platforms. People are used to working digitally now, and I think this is going to go forward. The meetings that I'm participating in about the future of diplomacy all say that the future is hybrid, and there is understanding that we have to try and preserve the best of person-to-person contact, but we are not going back to a purely face-to-face world. Apart from anything else, this is a great multiplier of funds. We can have distance meetings and save money. And I don't think my budget director is under any hurry to get me back on an airplane and pay for all that flying around that used to be necessary. So now to the contributions to the various categories within public diplomacy. So first of all, I've always argued that public diplomacy has to be based on listening. And this means knowing your audience, knowing the audience you're communicating with. Government to government dialogue and emphasis can be very misleading. And so I think that going forward, we're going to see, or we need to see, a greater emphasis on listening through social media, finding ways of reading social media. Now, in the United States, I'm sure you're not aware of this because I wasn't, but there are major legal restraints on what the American public diplomacy bureaucracy can do to track foreign social media. And it isn't only down to respecting privacy of foreign audiences. There's also a thing called the Paperwork Reduction Act, which makes it very difficult to harvest data. And this has now been raised formally and there is a plan afoot to remove these legal restraints so that the US can do a better job of listening through data. We're also seeing greater attention to the measurement and evaluation of public diplomacy work, though some would say too little money is earmarked to this. On any public diplomacy campaign, the US budgets about 3% for measurement and evaluation. I think there is the discussions that I've heard are talking about a greater emphasis on listening within the field, and on understanding that if you want diplomats to be honest about how they report their own work, you have to reward them for that honesty. So building rewards and even promotion into accurate reporting for public diplomacy activities. Otherwise, everything is a great success. And part of the problem is that the United States government had been paying for evaluation, but the evaluation had just been a challenge to try and invent the next superlative to describe how very well you were doing. And we're seeing also investigation of the role of artificial intelligence as a mechanism for speeding up listening processes. So finding ways of looking for particular triggers in mass amounts of data. But to me, probably the most important listening that needs to be going on right now is the tracking of adversaries. Just the looking at what your adversary is spending on media interventions is significant, and also there's some very interesting statistics coming out on bots and use of bots, for example, to multiply diplomatic discourse. I was reading this new report from Oxford on the Chinese use of bots to multiply diplomatic presence on Twitter, and it's increased 500% in the last couple of years. So this has to be part of listening too. Advocacy, what changes are happening in the advocacy area? Well, this is a key challenge in an era of contest where we see aggressive advocacy coming out of other places. Some of the forms of advocacy that have emerged in recent years, and I think we need to continue supporting, include fact-checking platforms, both fact-checking platforms owned by government media and sponsored by, supported by government media. My favorite is Stop Fake out of Kyiv in Ukraine. But it's so important that those platforms have reliable ongoing support, not only from people in the US, but other governments around Europe. I think we need to have a responsive structure. And one of the positive things that was done during the Trump period was a reorganization and integration of US advocacy to create a much more rational bureau structure in US public diplomacy. And we're waiting to see whether benefits can come from the new structure of American advocacy within the State Department. But it's necessary for diplomats to have the ability to speak for themselves and to speak in real time. And this requires a kind of confidence on the part of the foreign ministry that they don't use social media for micromanaging. The worst initials in social media to me are OSFA, one size fits all. When the central ministry thinks it can just put everything on a Twitter feed, it only needs like translations of the central Twitter feed, and there is no attempt to develop the there's no attempt to develop the social relationships between individual diplomats and their audiences. And I can talk about ways of doing that or ways in which this can work effectively during questions. But to me, one of the key things to do is to develop niche streams of social media in which individual diplomats are empowered through their job to speak authoritatively. So to have, for example, an arms control stream or a climate stream or a stream that's about alliances, so that the diplomat assigned to that topic will be able to speak authoritatively and in real time. I think diplomats need to be trained for 21st century outreach, and we're only now seeing the Diplomatic Academy, the Foreign Service Institute in the US, really getting its act together in how to operationalize this. But once we start talking about advocacy, we get to a much broader problem. Often advocacy works in terms of diplomats talking about what they're against, who they dislike, behaviors they oppose. But the history of public diplomacy shows that if we really want to deal with problems, we need to bring people together. And that means articulating not just what we're against, but also what we are for. And this has to happen at the highest level. So I'm talking now about leadership at the presidential level. And in terms of strategies, we need to look for more partnerships with actors who are credible to local audiences. And governments, especially the US government, have to realize that for many audiences, no government will be credible with the wider population. Final question on vision is a need for inclusivity. And I'll talk more about inclusivity later on. My third category is culture. It's important that cultural diplomacy is taken seriously. Minimally, cultural diplomacy is a mechanism for encouraging an international audience to see a country as human, rather like the training that a diplomat receives on if you're ever taken hostage, say as much about yourself so that your hostage taker sees you as a human being. Make sure they know your name, make sure they see the picture of your children. Well, cultural diplomacy minimally can do that in international affairs at a time when nations are being stereotyped. Culture can help the people behind the nation state to be visible. But I feel that it's time to free cultural diplomacy from the burden of delivering just national content. And it makes more sense to explore partnership between similar groups across frontiers. I think arts diplomacy has a particularly important role to play with in this, but that is one of the most neglected elements of American cultural diplomacy. I'm really, this is a big contrast to how things were in the 1950s and 60s, when explaining to the world about the American fine arts and the importance of American orchestras, the importance of American painting was one of the major elements of American strategy. When the American government, when the embassies could pay for anyone to come to the US as a journalist to understand the United States, about 20% of the journalists they selected were arts correspondents. So this was a major part of what America used to want to talk about. I believe it's important to meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. So this means an attention to elements of culture that people find interesting, as well as the elements of culture that you're proud of. And that means serious funding for the small State Department programs that currently deal with hip hop, with street art, and these, I think, have a potential to be part of America's reconnection with international audiences. Stable and confident societies are going to be more resilient to information warfare. So finding ways to work to develop both stability and confidence in other countries is important. And I see cultural work as being part of the context of counter disinformation. So it's removing the building stability and confidence in others is part of removing the context in which disinformation is more successful. Cultural exchange, rebuilding exchange. Here I see a great power in sustained contact. I'm sure that this is not a point I have to argue with you, but I think that there's a need for a cultural change around attitudes to the big exchange programs like Fulbright. Too often exchanges are seen as personal trophies for the individuals involved and not as tools of policy. So I think it's really important to ensure that the exchanges are working on policy priorities like climate, like migration, and other shared problems around the world. Second thing I'd say about exchanges is they have to map onto a psychological reality. That means understanding that a short-term exchange is very successful as a genre of exchange, and a long-term exchange, that great year you spent studying somewhere, is fantastic. And I know it's been part of your biographies as well as leaders within IRSEM. But medium exchanges, the exchange that lasts just 3 months, not only is it too short to be productive, it almost guarantees a counterproductive experience. It's like taking somebody to a place and at the moment of greatest culture shock, you pull them out. And I see this as being really problematic, investing money in that kind of experience. There's a need to ensure within exchanges that whatever people are coming into is a positive experience. So if you're bringing people into the country, it's important to ensure that they are well hosted and to build up the hosting experience. And that means working to encourage domestic participation, domestic buy-in into public diplomacy. The extension of that is that we need investment in the education sector, including investment in foreign student welfare, which is not always a strength of American universities. American universities welcome money of foreign students, but tend not to, I feel that foreign students are not properly looked after. There's also opportunities here to develop interests at the civic level, to encourage cities to be interested in exchange, and to explore creative ideas of sharing experiences. 10 years ago, we'd have said work on reality television about foreign students. Now, I think to look for blogs, to look for podcasts and vlogs dealing with foreign student experiences would be the way forward. Broadcasting. There's a general need in the world today for credible information. And I see a tremendous need for integrity and investment in the work of the US radio stations like Voice of America and in the rest of the legacy international media like France 24, like the BBC World Service and so forth. And yet we have to acknowledge that there is a serious crisis at the US agency in global media, and that this crisis is not coming solely from the mismanagement of that area during the Trump administration. In fact, I think that what happened was that the Trump administration showed up the structure that was weakened during previous years, really since the mid-1990s. Trump mismanagement showed the need for a clear legal buffer and a clear protection of international media activity coming out of the US government. In terms of where investment should go, it's important to understand that news is now a kind of meme. A story will be passed through many people to get to its cumulative line of users. So we're no longer in a situation where the broadcaster speaks, the listener listens. Now the broadcaster introduces material to a network, and the material is passed from person to person to person. The better the material, the more reliable the material, the more confidently it will be shared. And this is the formula moving forward. I think there's no alternative but to ensure absolute editorial integrity and to develop the way in which US media is serving as a surrogate. That means standing in for free media in other places in the world. This is particularly important as we can see free media is in retreat right now in so many places. But this requires the credibility, the integrity, requires distance from advocacy. And many people in the US Agency for Global Media, many journalists are now looking for a moment to make a break with the requirement of editorials at Voice of America. It would seem that this is a good time to move the editorial messaging aspect onto another platform or increase the distance between that kind of state-based message and news describing the world. We have a wider issue of media freedom, which is in crisis in so many places in the world and in ways that people haven't realized. Particular states are being criticized for their media freedom, and I'm glad to see that people are criticizing Saudi Arabia, that people are criticizing UAE, but they also need to be worried about India. They also need to be worried about the Philippines and places where journalists are subject to violence. I see power in the transparency provided by US-funded media. And an example of this, the reason why there's a little picture at the bottom of the screen of the citizen protests in Armenia, was that part of the reason the Armenian government couldn't clamp down on protests in 2017 was that those protests had been live streamed over Radio Free Europe. And protesters were coming into Radio Free Europe with saying, I have just been beaten by the police, speaking to the camera with blood coming down their head. So people in Armenia knew what was happening. The government couldn't deny it. And that transparency, the infrastructure of transparency is an essential antidote to the restriction of the strongman, the repression we see happening right now. It's important that the US government is honest about its failings, and maybe it's time to move Voice of America outside of Washington, DC, to try and geographically create a distance between the US government and the media that it subsidizes. But now I want to turn to the issue of dealing with disinformation, and the role that we have building back engagement. And by this, what I mean is that there's a role for conventional diplomacy in defending reputation in the world today. And part of this, I think, is for diplomats to recognize the scale of the crisis and to have a discussion, serious discussion, about the threat of media disruption and the opportunities for negotiating around a reduction in this threat. So part of what I'm saying here is that if information has been weaponized, we need an attention to a reduction or control of this weapon in the same way as if any other weapon was causing disruption in the world, we would raise it on a diplomatic agenda. There's a fallacy that a communications crisis needs a communications solution. And a good track record, I feel, of successful diplomacy against disinformation. And my example of this, as you see in the cartoon is from the time when the Soviet Union was connecting the US government to AIDS and saying that the AIDS virus had been created in a US government laboratory. This was very difficult, a great challenge to American diplomacy and reputation in the 1980s. And part of the way the US government dealt with this claim by the Soviets was not just by showing international audiences that it wasn't true, but was by putting a diplomatic leverage on the Soviet Union to say, if you want scientific cooperation in the field of AIDS research, you have to stop saying this about us. And the second part was saying, if you want arms reduction in other fields, if you want stability and a new kind of agreement with the United States, then this has to be dealt with too. And a combination of those two arguments pushed Gorbachev into stopping the AIDS libel and other major disinformation campaigns. And there's a sort of a 2-year period when this narrative is sort of lifted out of the global media. Then when Gorbachev loses control, of course, it all comes flooding back. But we know that with the right circumstances, this can work. Right now, the problem is that there are too few incentives for good behavior in terms of media and communication, and much asymmetry. And disinformation is a tremendous asymmetrical weapon. If you've got nothing, you can always tell a lie about somebody. And in fact, it's really interesting to go back into the 19th century and to see how insurgents would make up stories about their oppressors. And this was a great mechanism for giving you just a little bit of power, a little bit of psychological power in the presence of a hegemon. It was part of resistance to the British in India, for example, was making stuff up about them. The time will come when it's the right time to negotiate, and I think we need to prepare for that, but above all, to remember the possibility of negotiation around information warfare. Finally, reality. Remember, image follows reality. International audiences, I think, are very good judges of what is relevant to their life. I think we can rely on the global public to have an accurate idea of whether a country is doing good in the world. We may not like what they think, but the opinion of the international audience is the ultimate reality. And this means the United States needs to address genuine negatives. The whole Trump period saw a fall in the standing of the United States, driven by the category of American politics. People around the world were repelled by American politics. But by the end of the Trump years, people were also repelled by aspects of the American public. the American public were not seen as friendly to each other and were much less admired than they were at the beginning of the Trump period. And so this needs to be addressed, because part of this is based on a reality of dislike between Americans and genuine social tension in the United States. And I think that for many countries, international publics are more accurate judges of the country than one is oneself, because we are, of course, biased. But I think we need to, if the United States is prepared to help with shared challenges, if the United States is prepared to talk about social problems, talk about climate problems, and honestly say, we don't have all the answers, but we want to work together to build solutions. And we've seen some initiatives in that direction from Biden. That's a very good start. In terms of conventional diplomacy, there's value in a diverse diplomatic corps. So initiatives to bring minority diplomats to the fore, I think, are important. Some final thoughts about how to structure this work. And I think the watchword has to be interconnection. The figure in the diagram comes from the UK government, where in 2017, a new policy was adopted, a new doctrine called the Fusion Doctrine. And the point of the Fusion Doctrine was to acknowledge the interconnection of security, influence, and economic factors, and to say that all of these three things work together. And so there is no kind of division between soft power issues and the challenge of hard power challenges like law enforcement and military. So all problems have context. There are interconnections between the economy, security, and influence issues. But that includes, if you look at this diagram, the influence section includes social policy, making sure you have the right social policies in place. And I think any nation state right now has to understand that its positive reputation is like a goose that lays a golden egg. And you need to take care of the goose. For the UK, that means taking care of the education system. For the United States, that means taking care of innovation, making sure that the United States is still an aspirational place for the world. And each of you, for whichever country you represent, have to think about, well, what is it that is really admired? How do we preserve that for foreign audiences? Part of what's needed is leadership and institution building. So my conclusion is this is no era to neglect public diplomacy. And I'm reminded of an American song, and this was pointed out to me by one of the great American public diplomats of the 1960s. He said that what his approach to public diplomacy was to remember this song by the songwriter Johnny Mercer. And the song says, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch onto the affirmative, and don't mess with Mr. In Between. Now, the point of this is to say that it's necessary not only to talk about positive things, but to ensure the health of and develop a positive reality. And that needs investment, it needs institution building. Ultimately, you need to spend money on it if you're a government, and you need a leader who cares about it. And as of this presentation, there is no leader in American public diplomacy. Thank goodness, however, there is at least a Secretary of State who has written about public diplomacy. And so I'm optimistic going forward that this is something on Blinken's agenda. Thank you for your attention. You are welcome to email me, follow me on Twitter, and my podcast is called People, Places, Power. So, but thank you for your kind attention, everybody. So let's go to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeangène, for this fascinating presentation. And obviously, so we'll see if Tony Blinken is part of the positive, rebuilding the nation branding image of the United States. First of all, I will leave the floor to Maxime Audinet, who is going to ask you a few questions, and then Jean-Baptiste, Jeangène, Vilmer will take the lead, and I will come back with questions from the audience and my own questions as well.
Thank you, Maud. Nick, thank you very much for this presentation. It's a real pleasure and above all, a real honor for me to discuss it. After, as I said, having read a lot of your work during my PhD years, which, as I said, I devoted to the interpretation of soft power in Russia, and also the practices and actors of public diplomacy. And actually, I couldn't start this discussion without asking you a first question I have asked myself many times during these years, and which is, in fact, to what extent public diplomacy is compatible with authoritarianism. Put differently, what are, according to you, the fundamental distinctions between authoritarian states and liberal democracies when it comes to the practice of public diplomacy, to its communication flows, to the cultural resources that are mobilized, and also to the narratives that are promoted by the actors. And one of the positions I have defended in my research is that there is actually such a thing as a Russian public diplomacy, maybe in the cultural diplomacy or in the media spheres, but these practices are, they coexist and they are combined with more manipulative and stealthier practices of information influence, like disinformation, like selective and biased news coverage. And put another way, there is, I think, a full spectrum of state-sponsored or outsourced actors of influence in Russia, from cultural institutes or transnational media to troll farms and false flag news websites. These actors follow, they share, in many ways a common goal, which is, on the one hand, legitimizing the actions of the Russian government, and on the other hand, criticizing or disparaging the liberal democratic norms and institutions, but they do so by relying on different communication channels and resources, including those of public diplomacy.
Right.
And secondly, perhaps in a more empirical perspective, I would like to elaborate. I would like you to elaborate a bit more on your seventh point on the role and mutation of international broadcasting, or what several scholars call mediated public diplomacy, at a time when state-sponsored international communications are increasingly, as you know, framed in terms of information warfare, or in terms of weaponization of information, including in the COVID moment. And you are surely familiar with the fact that the Russian governments and doctrines, and by extension, the managers of Russian state media, have long considered the global information space as a fundamentally conflictual environment in which great powers compete to impose their views, to impose the narratives, and also, of course, to undermine those of their adversaries, which is in fact actually a representation of the information space that prevailed during the Cold War, of course, although in a more bipolar way.
Right.
So my question is the following here. Do you think that state-funded international media in liberal democracies should adapt actually to this moment of crisis you're describing by fully endorsing the narrative battle framework that have been endorsed by many authoritarian countries, and probably in the first place by Russia since the 2008 war in South Ossetia?
Yes. Yes.
You know, is it an approach that their journalists, that the journalists of liberal democracy, of media in liberal democracy want or are ready to follow? Should Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, but also the BBC or France 24 act as producers of offensive and selective contents, or even aggressive counter narratives in the information space? I think this is a position that is supported by perhaps, you know, Thomas Kent, the former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in his recent book entitled Striking Back? Or on the contrary, do you think that these media should leave this mission to other actors or institutions and therefore refuse, in fact, to participate to this narrative conflicts and rather subscribe to a more collaborative, credibility-driven pattern of, for example, the new public diplomacy, or to the most robust standards of journalistic deontology and transparent reporting? Right. Or perhaps you think that these two approaches, these two dimensions are compatible? I don't know.
Yes, no, that's right. Well, the first thing to say, Maxime, is that I think that if the approach of democracy to public diplomacy is not different from authoritarians, we have a problem. And I think that the overlap in methods used in the Cold War, where the US, UK were making stuff up, were secretly funding organizations, I think this was counterproductive. And I think there has to be a clear difference in approach over media between the West, between democracies and the rest. And part of this has to be an attention to freedom, to an interactive approach with audiences. And whether you're actually interested in what the other is experiencing, what they think, whether this is a two-way process, because part of the nature of propaganda is that propaganda is always a one-way process. When propaganda listens, it only listens in order to target more accurately. Propaganda is there to change the mind of the audience, not to explore the experience of the audience and to open the initiating power, whatever they might be, to some kind of change and some kind of convergence. So in terms of the model that you described, I think that we need to pay much more attention to the second half and the new public diplomacy, to collaborations, to surrogate media that actually work with people. And I think one of the problems right now in this information space is who can criticize when criticism is necessary. And the government voice is automatically counterproductive. And you can see that how, for example, mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang has been automatically dismissed as being something that Chinophobes say. So we have to find a way of working with people who love China, whose interest in China is above question, so that those voices are part of criticism, and self-criticism too. But I think it's I also think that there is a place for the narrative duel and for pushing back. But the problem I see is that there are people who don't even think that it's worth funding the two-way communication or a more open or ethical communication. So it's much more important that I say something about the need for that right now. But I'd love to keep talking to you about this because you really have raised a fundamental question.
Okay, Maxime, you had another question, right?
No, that was my two questions. But perhaps I don't know if you could be more specific regarding the case of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, because for example, I worked a lot on the comparison between in France between RT and Sputnik on the one hand, and France 24 and RFI on the other end, and to try to to emphasize the difference in the constructions of content, the construction of information. And for example, you can notice, which this is one of the aspects, even if they have many common points regarding, for example, the funding, but France 24 would not hesitate, for example, to criticize the action of the French government in, let's say, Africa or another country, which is something that you never see on RT and Sputnik, at least not directly, of course. But so since Voice of America and Radio Free Europe have, of course, the heritage of the Cold War, and this narrative conflict was at the core of their missions during the Cold War against, for example, Radio Moscow. Do you think that they are able, and their journalists or editor-in-chief are able today to emancipate themselves from this approach, or on the contrary,
No, well, they want, certainly at Voice of America, they really want to be free to speak about problems within the United States, and historically they've been able to, and even during the Trump period. For example, last year, Voice of America won a major prize for a series dealing with child marriage. And it looked at problems in Pakistan, it looked at problems in Africa, and then it looked at problems in the rural United States where little girls are forced to get married, maybe because they're part of a religious cult. And it was a brilliant piece of journalism. And I think it's important that the United States, Ed Murrow said, it can't be presented only in superlatives. And people around the world are not stupid. And what I'd like to know is whether the involvement of a state with tendentious material, when a state is identified with lies and distortions, whether that, are we yet at a position where that is a negative for the aggressor state? And you know, I'm planning to work with opinion poll data, yes, to try and get at that, because at some point it will be, and at some point in the past we've seen identification with disinformation, with making stuff up as a problem for a national image. It was a problem for the image of Britain in the 1930s, that Britain had been involved with disinformation during the First World War. We were able to get out of it by being completely honest about the problems in World War II. And so, you know, I don't think an image is forever. It can be enduring, but it isn't necessarily forever. But we need to know whether today's audiences dislike a country that makes stuff up. A big part of the US anti-disinformation strategy in the 80s was to take a story that made sense to audiences in Africa or Asia, and to share it in Europe, and to say, look, this is what the Russians are saying in Africa and Asia. And it would just seem so absurd. It would make the Soviet Union seem like an absurd, ridiculous actor. And this is still a reliable strategy. It's one that the Israelis use to tell the West about the nature of Hamas, for example, is to show how the absurd things that they say to their own people. And I think this is still a good strategy, but we need to know the extent to which it's a good strategy, the extent to which people now segment countries and say, this is an honest country and this is a country that makes stuff up. Because, you know, for example, you look at Russian presentation of Scandinavia, and this is frankly hilarious, where there's an emphasis on sex. Whenever they can find a story to do with sex in Scandinavia, they will talk about it, including sex with animals. And there's an obsession on Sputnik that in Denmark, there are brothels for people who want to have sex with animals. And so ultimately, this will be more of a problem for the Soviet Union. Sorry, this will be more of a problem for Russia as disinformation was more of a problem for the Soviet Union, but we're not at that stage yet. At the moment, people are still thinking, whoa, what's this weird stuff going on in Scandinavia?
Okay. Many thanks, Nick. Many thanks, Maxime, as well. I will leave the floor to Jean-Baptiste, Jeangène, Vilmer, and I think Nick, you said at the end of your presentation that U.S. public diplomacy will need a new leader, and for the time being, it's only Tony Blinken who takes the lead. Nice. Perhaps U.S. public diplomacy and the entire strategy of countering disinformation needs to be rebuilt or need to be reformed. And perhaps this is something that you may discuss with Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maud, and thank you again, Nick, for your excellent talk. So there are a lot of interesting points that could be discussed, but in the interest of time, I'll focus, as Maud just said, on the part of your presentation, which is on countering disinformation, because also this is the part I'm the most interested in. And more specifically, I'd like to raise two issues. So the first one is the transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration and what it means in terms of the US system that you have to counter foreign disinformation. You have the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, that has been established in 2016 within the State Department. And it's supposed to, I quote the original text, direct, lead, synchronize, integrate, and coordinate efforts of the federal government in that matter. So the GEC has considerable resources, and I believe its budget even doubled for 2021 compared to 2020. But in practice, so please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it's having a hard time to actually direct, lead, and coordinate because there is a strong competition that is coming from both within the State Department. In particular, they have powerful regional bureaus, and also, and most of all, probably at the interagency level. There are many other relevant units, some at DoD, others at DHS, Justice, there is the FBI, obviously the intelligence services and all that. So during the Trump administration, there was clearly a lack of coordination, probably an intentional one, between all these teams, because there was no clear guidance coming from the NSC, the National Security Council, and the White House. It's obviously a highly political issue. There was no interest on part of Trump to fix this issue. So my first question for you, Nick, is that in its first month that we've seen now, would you say that the Biden administration showed more interest and more determination to better coordinate all those considerable resources? And how do you think it could be done more effectively than it has been done in the previous years?
Well, I agree with you. I just agree with your assessment, Jean-Baptiste. I think that and really this is a point where you need somebody at the Secretary of State level to elevate these communication issues above the regional. And you know, the power of regional bureaus this is a long-standing problem within the State Department, and something that, you know, this has been going on as a problem for 20 years. And one of the advantages during the 1980s was that there was an agency, you know, USIA, devoted to thinking about American communication. I do not favor the recreation of USIA, but I do think that leaders need to recognize the value in a coordinated response to disinformation. And but, you know, for disinformation to be really effective, it needs to connect to some kind of reality. And the problem for the United States is not that disinformation is making stuff up, but it's making stuff up based on genuine American problems. And I think that one of the functions that it's interesting to see the Sputnik acting as a kind of a mirror image of American government media in the 1980s by becoming a platform for genuine dissidents within American society. And you look at the journalists who are recruited to RT, people like Chris Hedges, people like John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower, and these people can't get a platform in the US. And so, you know, in a weird way, sometimes the Russian media is able to present itself as an agency of free media. And so I think there are genuine problems within American society and American media, which open up opportunity for hostile media, hostile platforms. And so there's a need to deal with the genuine problems that we can see coming out of. We need to, where disinformation is widening a crack, okay, we need to deal with the crack, not just deal with the widening. Does that make sense, Jean-Baptiste?
Yeah,
so
sure,
I think
sure.
it needs to be tied to a social agenda, and we need to be honest about, and this was part of, so for example, in the 1950s, when Soviet media directed attention to American racism. Eisenhower, you know, I know from Eisenhower's papers, he was much more concerned about what Khrushchev thought than what Martin Luther King thought. You know, and part of the reason that the world was interested in civil rights was because the Soviet Union was talking about it. And in fact, they talked about it so much, it became a little bit of a joke within Russia that Russians would say, oh, but remember, they're lynching people in the United States. You know, so whenever anybody criticized something in Russia, you would say, oh, but, you know, hey, isn't it worse in America? And that was a kind of a complex joke backwards. But I think that, you know, just because your enemy is saying it doesn't mean it isn't true at some level, and doesn't mean you shouldn't address that as a problem.
Sure, it's certainly a good point. I completely agree with you. I had another question, Maud. I don't know if I can ask it, or should we open
yes, you have plenty of time, and then we will move to questions from the audience and from colleagues on the panel. So go ahead, Jean-Baptiste.
Okay, so my other point, Nick, was about international cooperation, not internal cooperation within the different agencies in DC and elsewhere, but international, in particular transatlantic cooperation, because there are already several existing cooperation formats like the EU, NATO, and G7. They're quite useful already to coordinate the fight against information manipulation, but they have intrinsic limitations because they were obviously created for other purposes. So they can be too broad, or they can be too narrow, or they can be even both at the same time. If you take the EU and NATO, for example, both of them, they both include unlike-minded states and they exclude like-minded states. Take Australia, for example. And there are obviously a wide range of divergences. So since a couple of years, we've seen a growing number of calls for more or less formal establishment of a counter-disinformation ad hoc coalition of like-minded actors. I'm referring here to, for example, what Alina Polyakova and Dan Fried published a couple of years ago. I believe it was in 2018, and they did a second edition since then. So of course, it's not that simple, and there are many questions. And are we talking about something like an alliance of democracies? What does it mean exactly? Should we include civil society organizations, digital platforms? So my question is, what's your take on this? What do you think would be the best international format, if it's not existing already, to cooperate on counter disinformation?
Well, I certainly think that there's a need for cooperation, that there's a scope for cooperation, and especially a thing I've looked at is there's opportunities to cooperate in listening. and in selective language services. So for example, right now, you can see that there's a need for, say for example, for broadcasting in Burma, in Myanmar, and in languages of Myanmar. Does everybody need to do it? Or maybe we could say, well, the United States can use Radio Free Asia for that purpose, and the another country can broadcast, can focus on another place that then frees the United States from broadcasting in that particular language. So we don't have to all broadcast in every language. Maybe we can go further and be more granular in our approach if we share out the responsibility. I think that in the Cold War, it was important to share listening. If you're trying to understand how did the US know what was happening in the East Bloc, that was because of the audience research conducted by Radio Free Europe, but they segmented with BBC World Service. So there was exchange of listening happening all the time. It's really an unappreciated story of how allies worked together to understand what was going on. And so I think we can jointly monitor global media. So no, absolutely, I'm in favor of cooperation, but would say that cooperation should include not duplicating services unnecessarily and coordinating listening. Following 9/11, this was a total mess. The United States had 6 different agencies that were monitoring Al Jazeera, but nobody looking at any other Arab television channel or media sources were completely neglected. So they all went after, it's like watching 5-year-olds play soccer, where they're all chasing the ball, in like some kind of herd running around the pitch.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much. Jean-Baptiste, do you have any more questions?
No, I'm fine.
Right. So before I open the questions to the floor, I would have perhaps two questions for you, Nick, and then I will try to gather the questions from the audience. The first one has to do also with coordinating actors, and perhaps when we are talking about leading actors when it comes to counter-disinformation or building a counter-disinformation response, we also have to take into account the role of Congress. And tell me if I'm correct, but in March 2020, there were several hearings before US Senate in particular, and during those hearings, the role of the Global Engagement Center that Jean-Baptiste just mentioned was underlined, and there was a kind of a will to coordinate or to underline the role of the Global Engagement Center and the US AGM that you mentioned, US Agency for Global Media, and the emphasis was also put on the role of US AID. And the instrumental role that those agencies may play in certain places of the globe, such as Ukraine, for instance. Interesting also was the nomination, as I mentioned earlier, before we get started with the seminar, as I mentioned that one of the first nominations of the Biden administration when it comes to public diplomacy was the nomination of Kelu Chao, this Taiwanese journalist, heading now the US AGM. So what kind of image and message does that send to the world, and what kind of message does that send also more specifically to Asia? Is the United States public diplomacy turning now, pivoting to Asia, as we mentioned, much more than dealing with perhaps transatlantic strategies? And my second question will have to do also with the role of new medias and all media, if I may say so, in Ukraine. So Can we get started with the role of Congress and coordinating agencies?
Well, let me just talk about the, I think the appointment at Voice of America was about affirming professionalism and appointing somebody who was a professional, who was appreciated internally. So it's turning away from politics and towards professionalism. I don't think it was intended to signal in terms of region, but I wouldn't contradict somebody who saw that as a message within the appointment.
Okay. Also, when we're talking about actors and coordinating actors, we've been talking about institutional actors, but also there are other actors, private ones, and you're talking from Los Angeles and you're very close to the Silicon Valley, and we all have in mind the role of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, especially in that particular part of the world. And again, during those hearings before United States Senate, the role of Google and Twitter and Facebook was mentioned during the electoral campaign and the elections in Taiwan. And I wanted to know how the coordination, according to you, was made between the Global Engagement Center, diplomats, public diplomacy diplomats, and those new media platforms.
Well, I think that's a really important. I think that's a really important issue, and I think that the tech giants have the ability to undermine what the US is doing in terms of its public diplomacy, because they have shown themselves ready and willing and able to work with dictators. And I think this is a tremendous problem. And they are not charities. They go where the money is. And if they can make money from a dictator, they will do. And the inordinate power of the platforms is a tremendous problem. And it's a tremendous problem for academics to study that, because who's going to pay for academics to do the study? So we have many academics who take money from the platforms to study the platforms. And how can we legitimately hope to pull that, to get to the bottom of what's going on? So I'm very concerned about it, and don't see an easy answer.
Okay. So according to you, this is going to be a very tricky issue for the Biden administration to come back to Google, Apple, Facebook, and Twitter, as it was the case under the Obama administration, for example, and yes, this close relationship between the U.S. Department of State and the platform of the Silicon Valley is going to be more difficult, also perhaps because of domestic concerns, I imagine.
Yes, that's right.
Let me take 3 questions from the audience. The first one has to do with one of the leading theme of this seminar, and that has to do with the migration of nationalist and conspiracy movements, especially QAnon, from classic social networks to specific far-right networks. And this has raised the issue of the migration of Donald Trump's supporters to new arenas of expression. Moreover, QAnon theories have spread in Europe, France, Germany, Latin America, Brazil in particular, and they have reached governments, dissidents, and anti-vax people as well. So to what extent, according to you, are those new propaganda ecosystems a threat to the US, whether for its national security or its reputational security? Thank you.
I think that they're a tremendous threat, but they also show problems domestically. I think, within the countries that are taking this on. I mean, part of the nature of rumor is that it goes where there is an absence. If you have a good idea about something, you don't need the rumor. Okay, so rumors fill in absences, they fill in the blank spaces in the mental map. They make connections that people are susceptible to. So I think that QAnon, the idea that that would take off as a theory in Europe shows problems within Europe, and the need to it goes once again to the existence of social fissures that can be exploited by hostile media. It's in a way a little reassuring that craziness doesn't have to come across international frontiers, and that there are people within the United States who are completely capable of subverting and disrupting society. We don't need Russians to do it for us. But I still think there's a need to acknowledge the problems and to look for solutions. And all one can say is that media literacy, greater media literacy would help. And I'm interested in some of the proposals that, for example, Nina Jankovic has made coming out of the Wilson Center in Washington, where she says that we've become used to social distancing in terms of meeting people. We need informational distancing too, so that we're careful about the information we pass on to people. I don't know if one of the really interesting things that's happened with QAnon is a kind of a joining up of the far right with the, what would you say, the wellness, new age, yoga, religion people, so that through the discussion over vaccines, I think primarily, so we're now seeing yoga instructors endorsing Trump and things like, and conspiratorial crystal people. And you see this, I guess, on the 6th of January, the man who had the horns on, who was a non-indigenous person trying to channel indigenous religious practices. That these are all starting to come together in some kind of crazy amalgamation. So I think you're correct in identifying the problem, and I don't know the situation, but I don't know the solution. But it has to be taken very seriously.
Your concern about the platform of the Silicon Valley is shared by members of our audience who are mentioning that after the event of January 6th, as you mentioned, the question of one of a person in the audience is about, are you seeing, or are you think that Google, Facebook, and Amazon in particular are becoming new censors in Western democracies, and is it going to be and their decision are going to erode U.S. public diplomacy per se, since private companies have begun to operate on the judicial and political framework of American institutions. So it's part of the discussion we've already had, but perhaps you have
no, I have nothing to add to that, but I think it's an important thing to think about.
Okay, so perhaps we can take another question coming from the audience as well, to how to rebuild US public diplomacy in Ukraine in particular, which has been a field of American assistance since the Euromaidan movement and the beginning of the war in the Donbass in particular region. There's a mention to USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy in that question.
Yes.
And after the forms of propaganda under the Trump administration, the Hunter Biden case, and the request for investigation at the dawn of Joe Biden's inauguration campaign in particular. Thank you.
I was part of a study in Ukraine, and what I saw and what journalists complained about, what free media in Ukraine complained about, was support being too short and too unreliable. So I would want to see longer investment longer term investment and to see support being much more dependable, so that free media isn't, free media can cooperate more effectively with oligarch media. Because how can you have free and reliable media in Ukraine when the most productive people are recruited away to just help an oligarch develop their image? And this is a real problem for media, free media like Hromadski, trying to work in the Russian language in Ukraine. So I would want to see a long-term commitment with reliable budgets and a stability in American support, because the unpredictability plays into the unpredictability is damaging, because the other side is incredibly predictable. You know exactly what they're going to do, which is everything. It's our side that is unpredictable, and we need to address that.
And perhaps coordinating all medias like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty that you mentioned with fact-checking platforms such as a Media Reform Center in particular there. Okay, so I'm trying to gather other questions and to come back to the Americas. Some member of the audience or the panel are underlying the fact that there are many certainly great power competition in the field of information as well in Latin America right now, with political events. The one person has mentioned what's going on in Colombia, but we've been mentioning also US Senate hearings, underlining that certainly disinformation and information competition in that particular area of the Americas is a focus of certainly US effort to counter disinformation. What is your take on that and your insights about countering disinformation and information competition in the south of the continent? Thank you.
That's something that I haven't looked closely at. I'm afraid I've been so focused on other parts of the world. So maybe this is something where I should listen to what you have to say about, or what the questioner has to say about.
We would love to have you perhaps for our next session dedicated to what's going on in Colombia more particularly, but perhaps Maxime, you have something to add about media competition in Latin America, something, a theme or an issue we've already tackled during our discussions.
No, just in a few words, I don't really know about the role of US international media in Latin America, but yes, the Russian international broadcasting networks is very well developed in South America since I think 2009, and they have developed a line that is an editorial policy that is very close to the left wing and Bolivarian left in the of the political spectrum, and they find a common goal and a common they find common views in criticizing US imperialism on the continent, of course. And so you can see also perhaps a junction between the socialist, progressive, anti-interventionist line that you've talked about, Nick, regarding RT America with Chris Hedge, for example, and people on RT and Espanol also sharing the same views. Right. So this is something that is interesting regarding the editorial policy that you can observe in Europe with this Russian media, which is more close to the right-wing sovereignist, political
well,
side
you
of.
could see this around the issue in Venezuela and Russian attempts to insert themselves into Venezuela. But one thing I hope that might happen is that the US will get beyond an obsession with Cuba and develop Spanish language media in general, rather than framing it all in terms of the counter Cuba material out of Martí in Miami.
Mm.
So I think they should go back to the when Voice of America had a Spanish service for everybody, and to think about the Spanish language generally, rather than framing it, because it's been so dominated by the needs of the Cuban situation, or of the Cuban American community to be.
Yeah, Martí is only the outreach of Martí is only in Cuba. Yes, it's okay, and it's controlled by the Cuban diaspora in
Yeah, it's run to please the Cuban diaspora. Okay. So yeah, that's right.
Okay, we have two last questions before we end that particular session, and before I leave the floor, if my colleague have one or two more questions, but two questions from the audience. The first one has to do with how do you see the role of non-Western democracies such as Japan and India? We've already more or less answer that question, but perhaps you could
I'm troubled. I should say that
a little bit on those two countries in particular. And the last one would be in your idea that we need to relaunch public media to push for reliable information, and are you suggesting that private media are suffering of a sort of market failure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so private media, absolutely. I think there's a crisis in private media, and we need people to demand better media, and people will get the media they want, but they have to ask for it. With regards to India and Japan, I think that for these countries to be reputationally secure, they have to think about their internal conditions. And there are aspects of life in India that I think need to be attended to. I'm very worried by things that are happening in India, and we need India to be strong and democratic. It's an important place in the world. Similarly, so I'm concerned by political extremism in India and by signs of instability in India. Similarly, in Japan, I think there are real problems and failures at the government level, and that for Japan to be Japan has to find a way of collaborating effectively with collective solutions. And it can't just pick and choose which issues is it going to be part of. And my concern with Japan is that it has such a strong sense of self that sometimes it holds problems at arm's length and holds people at arm's length. And I think that there's I'm troubled by the future of the image of Japan. There seem to be fundamental weaknesses within the Japanese state that at some point will affect the world will notice, and will the image of I don't see how the positive image of Japan is sustainable in the as it is right now, where it's consistently shows up as one of the top 5 countries in the world. How can that be sustained given the internal difficulties within the country right now? But there's a much bigger conversation to be had there. I'm sorry to address a place as significant as Japan with just a few throwaway lines that I'm concerned, but it's the truth. I am concerned.
All right. Nick, many thanks. We have already a few more questions, but time is running out, and you're expected in Mexico, and what is the other country you're talking
and Hong Kong. So I've got 4.
Mexico and Hong Kong, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So many thanks for giving a world tour and starting with Paris and France this afternoon.
I hope I can come and see you soon in person.
Yes, you're absolutely welcome. And many thanks to Jean-Baptiste, Jeangène, Vilmer for discussing your paper. Many thanks to Maxime as well, and to our colleague from the Institut des Amériques and the entire IRSEM team. So we have to end the seminar right now. We can say a few words in private if I may, and thank you everyone for participating into this new edition, new session of IDEA IRSEM seminar. We are going to meet for a special event next time on the 27th. The next session will be dedicated to event in Colombia with the Radio France Internationale, which is our own French international global media. Thank you very much, everyone. And good afternoon and good morning again, Nick. So you stay with us for a few minutes if you have time.
Oh, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you
so much. Merci, Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you, Nick.
Merci. Au revoir. Bye-bye.
Merci à tous. Jean-Baptiste, Velu aussi, Gabriel, Kevin. On débriefera. Nick, see you soon, and I hope in person, perhaps in California, East or West Coast, in Paris,
so.
we hope. And Maxime and I are waiting for you, Jean-Baptiste and Kevin as well. So we hope to organize also an event on the book Information Warfare in the Digital Age. And obviously we may organize something hybrid again. So you're particularly welcome.
And so, but when will it be out in English?
We don't know. I don't have a very exact date. We have to see with Palgrave Macmillan, working with the Presse Universitaire de France. But you know, they're dealing with part of them. They're using Indian editors, so it may go fast or not, because we do have an experience with them. Kevin was part of the team for that particular book, and Jean-Baptiste as well. So we know that this may go fast, but also we have to double check perhaps the translation in English. So
sure.
for your paper, not a problem. For ours.
No, I just did something for the Basque for Catalonia, and they translated what I'd written. I sent them an English manuscript. They translated it into Catalan and then translated it back into English rather than using my paper.
Excellent. But we're not going to do that for your paper, right?
That's good. That's good.
We're not going to do that. No worries. Don't worry. Sorry.
So okay. The Translators Union isn't insisting.
So many thanks again, Nick, for being with us, and many thanks to the entire team. We will get back to you perhaps for a written paper, because we're about to, perhaps in September, we will be releasing papers after, you know, ending the seminar session. So obviously we will release the paper in English, not in French that time. So perhaps it would be more interesting for you, and we will publish that online. Okay. So bye-bye, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Good afternoon and travel safe. Merci à tous. Bon, j'espère que ça vous a...
Je crois, Maud, qu'on est toujours sur Facebook en live.
D'accord. Bon, eh ben, c'était pas le but, puisqu'on devait arrêter à 15, mais c'est pas grave. Nous avons rien dit qui ne soit pas intéressant pour notre...
Non, mais c'est la raison pour laquelle je me permets de te le signaler.
D'accord. Ben, retrouvons-nous donc pour notre prochaine édition dans une semaine pile sur la Colombie, et c'est Camille qui présidera cette session. Merci à tous. Je crois que ça intéresse beaucoup nos auditeurs et aussi les personnes qui visionnent donc ces rencontres sur Facebook. Merci à tous, on se voit bientôt.
Merci Maud.
Au revoir, merci.
Bonne soirée à tous.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.